For nearly 300 years, no Ottoman Sultan had died at the hands of his own soldiers. Tonight, that tradition ends. This is Yedikule, the Seven Towers, Istanbul's most feared dungeon. Inside the carriage that just passed through the gate sits a man who, until yesterday morning, held the most powerful throne in the world. The men outside the door are waiting for orders. The man inside is 17 years old. How does a 17-year-old sultan end up in this room? For the answer, we go back 3 days. The year was 1622. On the morning of May the 18th, Istanbul woke up to a rumor. Sultan Osman the Second was preparing to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, and his tents were already being moved across to Üsküdar. A sultan going on pilgrimage was almost unheard of, but pilgrimage wasn't really the issue. The rumor spreading through the ranks was far more frightening, that the sultan would use the journey as a pretext to raise a new army in Anatolia and Syria, and disband the Janissary Corps once he returned. That same day, toward noon, the Janissaries and cavalrymen gathered in the hippodrome. The angry crowd first marched on the mansion of Ömer Efendi, the sultan's tutor, and looted it. Their next target was the mansion of the Grand Vizier, Dilava Pasha. By evening, the young sultan understood how serious this had become and sent clerics to ask the rebels what they wanted. The answer wasn't a full list yet, but the city didn't sleep that night. So had this anger built up in a single day? No. For that, we need to go back 4 years. 4 years earlier, in February of 1618, a child had taken the Ottoman throne. Osman the Second was not yet 14. His uncle, Mustafa the First, had been removed from the throne only 96 days into his reign on grounds of mental instability and shut away in a chamber of the palace. Osman was ambitious, well-educated, wrote poetry, and dreamed big. But even on the day he took the throne, the power that put him there wasn't his own will, it was the balance of forces inside the palace. And the most important pillar of that balance was the Janissary Corps. On the second day of the uprising, the crowd was no longer negotiating. They had a list in hand. They wanted the heads of 6 men, including the Grand Vizier Dilava Pasha, the chief eunuch Süleyman Aga, and the Sultan's tutor Ömer Efendi. The young Sultan refused. Handing state officials over to the mob would mean surrendering the throne's own authority. But that refusal opened the uprising's final act. The crowd pushed against the palace gates and forced their way in. The palace of a vast empire stood defenseless against its own soldiers. Inside the palace, the rebels were looking for a man who had been locked away for 4 years. The former Sultan, Mustafa the First. They found him exhausted in the chamber where he'd been confined and put him back on the throne. From that hour on, Mustafa's mother, Halim Sultan, became the most powerful figure in the palace. That same day, the furious crowd caught the 2 men who hadn't been handed over with their own hands. Dilava Pasha and Süleyman Aga were killed. Osman had lost everything in a single day. So why did the Janissaries hate their own sultan this much? The answer lies on a battlefield 1 year earlier. 1 year earlier, in the summer of 1621, Osman the Second had led his army on a campaign against Poland. The target was the fortress of Khotyn. After weeks of siege, the fortress never fell. On October the 6th, a treaty was signed, and the campaign was officially declared a victory. But the young sultan had seen the truth. The Janissaries hadn't wanted to fight, and had obeyed orders to attack only reluctantly. Osman returned to Istanbul furious. He had the Corps' pay records investigated. After roll calls turned up men who simply weren't there. In the soldiers' eyes, the Sultan had become a threat, a man who looked down on them and wanted to replace them with a new army. The pilgrimage preparations were the final spark that lit that suspicion. On top of it, Osman was breaking with tradition in other ways too. He had stepped outside palace custom and married the daughter of the chief religious authority, the Sheikhul Islam. Across the capital, everyone could sense something was about to break. Having already lost his throne, Osman slipped out of the palace on the night between May the 19th and May the 20th and took refuge at Ağa Kapısı, the residence of the Janissary commander. The plan was simple: win over the Corps' commander and part of the Janissaries, and take the throne back. By morning, this last plan had also collapsed. The rebels stormed the residence and captured the former sultan. From there, Osman was taken to Orta Cami, the Janissary's own mosque. The sultan of yesterday was now a prisoner. According to accounts passed down at the time, he was dressed in shabby clothes, unfit for a sultan, and carried through the crowd on an ordinary horse. The same accounts say he addressed the soldiers there, promising to forgive everything if they returned to their duty, but no one listened. At that same hour, back in the palace, a new Grand Vizier had been appointed, Kara Davud Pasha, who was married into the royal family. The new administration faced a single problem. A former sultan, still alive, was a threat that could return at any moment. As long as Osman lived, none of the uprising's participants would be safe. Some people that day remembered something that had happened a year before. In January of 1621, before setting out on campaign, Osman had ordered the strangling of his own brother, Prince Mehmed, a boy only 4 months younger than himself. The Shaykhul Islam had refused to issue the religious ruling authorizing the execution, so the ruling was obtained from another scholar instead. According to the accounts, with his final breath, Mehmed cried out to his brother, "Osman, you have taken my life. I pray your reign meets the same fate." In the final days of that same month, a winter so severe fell on Istanbul that the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus partly froze over, and people walked across the ice from Eminönü to Galata. People at the time took it as an omen of disaster, and the event was even recorded in the book written by the eyewitness who chronicled the uprising. The decision was made on the afternoon of May the 20th. Osman was put into a carriage and taken to Yedikule, the old fortress built into the city walls. No one spoke along the way. The Sultan of yesterday watched his own capital from inside the carriage for the last time. In the evening, Davud Pasha's men entered the cell. According to the sources of the time, a noose was thrown first. 17-year-old Osman did not submit and fought back against the men despite the rope around his throat. In the end, one of them, known as Kalender Urusu, finished it. For the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan had been killed by the decision of his own army, in his own capital. According to the accounts, his ear was cut off as proof of his death and sent to Halime Sultan, the new sultan's mother. The reason we know these 3 days in such detail is a single eyewitness who lived through the events. Hüseyin Tugi, a member of the Janissary Corps, wrote down what he had seen just weeks after the uprising. His work, known as the Musibetname, is a first-hand account of the killing of a sultan. The event wasn't confined to Ottoman sources alone. Thomas Roe, the English ambassador in Istanbul at the time, described these 3 days of the city in his reports back to London. In other words, this story is documented by independent witnesses on both sides. Let's correct 2 common misconceptions. First, unlike in TV dramas, Qasım Sultan is not a documented actor in these 3 days. Osman wasn't her biological son, and sources from the period give her no active role in this uprising. The powerful woman in the palace during these days was Halime Sultan, Mustafa's mother. Second, the young man in the famous folk ballad Genç Osman is not this sultan. That ballad tells the story of a different young soldier who scaled the walls years later during the siege of Baghdad. The 2 stories have been mixed up for centuries. The story didn't end there. The countdown now started running for the killers themselves. Davud Pasha lasted only 24 days as Grand Vizier. 8 months later, in January of 1623, he was executed, held responsible for Osman's killing, and it happened within the very same walls where Osman himself had died, at Yedikule. In Anatolia, the governor of Erzurum, Abaza Mehmed Pasha, rose up, declaring he wanted vengeance for Osman's blood, launching a rebellion that would drag on for years. On the throne, Mustafa the First didn't even last a year. In September of 1623, he was removed for a second time. His successor was Osman's younger brother, 11-year-old Murad IV. Years later, that child would become one of the empire's most feared sultans, and he never forgot how his brother had died. Osman's body was buried in the tomb of his father, Ahmed I, in Sultanahmet. A 17-year life, a 4-year reign, and 3 days burned into the empire's memory were left behind. As for Mustafa the First, put back on the throne for a second time, he had never wanted to rule at all. Sources describe him receiving his removal almost like a release. He spent the rest of his life in a corner of the palace and died quietly in 1639. The Janissary Corps, drawing power from those 3 days, lived on for another 200 years. From then on, every sultan felt the Corps' shadow on the back of his neck the moment he took the throne. But Osman's idea of a new army wasn't buried with him. That idea became reality 204 years later in the hands of another sultan, Mahmud II, abolished the Janissary Corps completely in 1826. The war that young Osman lost in 3 days, the dynasty won 2 centuries later. So what was Osman the Second? To some, he was a reformer, ahead of his time, sacrificed while trying to overhaul the army. To others, an inexperienced adventurer who tried to change everything at once without understanding the balance of power within the state. The sources only tell us what happened. They don't hand down a verdict on who's to blame. That verdict is yours. Was Osman a victim, or did he bring about his own downfall? Let us know in the comments. This video was part of our Feared Sultans series. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's next, because another countdown is coming. The final days of Selim the Grim, the man who doubled a vast empire in just 8 years. Did he die of a boil, or was it something else? Was it really an infection, or wasn't it the evidence in the next episode?